So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is actually video number 4 of widening my RV gate. In video number 1, I just remounted my post of my original gate that came with this house. Instead of being on the inside of the cinder block to the outside, that gave me an extra 6 inches, maybe a little bit more, and then I modified the gate that was on there to widen it a little bit. In the second video, I installed my cinder block post and a steel beam to hold the new gate. In the third video, I actually built this 13-foot RV gate, and in this video I am actually going to be mounting the gate, and eventually I plan on doing a 5th video. I want to install an electric gate opener. So let's get to it. So I ended up having to do a couple things before sending my gate down to get powder coated. One was welding the hinges on the gate itself. I ended up going 6 inches down, thinking I would be plenty good. However, my hinges had to be right at the top of my fence post, so I should have measured and figured that out a little better before sending it down. The other thing I had to do was drill the holes for the wooden slats, and I did that before it went to powder coating, so I wouldn't have to worry about messing up the powder coating when it got back drilling the holes. So when I'm marking multiple things all at the same distance, I just put a little mark on my square. That way I don't have to actually concentrate every time when I make a mark. I mark that, I know exactly where I need to mark my bar, and then I just go to town. It makes it go really quickly. So I always keep a can of brake clean around the house, and when I use a permanent marker to mark something on one of my aluminum squares, I can just take a little brake clean, spray it on there, and wipe it off with a paper towel. However, you don't want to do this on a plastic square because it will dry it out and discolor it. Since I was going to use 1/4-inch carriage bolts for my wood slats, that's the size hole I drilled. I didn't think about the fact that when I send it to powder coating, that powder coating is going to tighten that hole up a little bit. So it ended up being a little bit of a pain to get the bolts in. I should have went a couple sizes bigger than 1/4-inch. So originally the posts were mounted to the inside of the wall right here. I had moved those to the outside to gain another 6 inches or so. I am going to use the same anchors to mount the bracket I made. So the bracket I made, I used a 4-inch piece of flat bar and a 2-inch piece of angle, and just tack welded it in a couple places. My gate's going to be coming in at an angle now instead of straight, so that's why I did the angle iron instead of a square tube. I put about 1.5 inch piece of wood at the bottom, just so the bottom of this piece doesn't get rusted out over time from sitting right on the ground. I had already drilled some 1/4-inch holes in the flat bar. I have a rotor hammer, however, just a hammer drill will work to drill into masonry with a masonry bit. So you just push these anchors into place and then smack them with a hammer, and it spreads the anchor into the masonry block. So I anchored one, then drilled the rest of the holes, and continued to anchor the rest of them, just smacking them into place. These anchors are called hammer drive wedge anchors, and you can get them at Lowe's or Home Depot. So this ended up being kind of an all hands on deck as far as the family goes, so I didn't get as many videos as I would have liked. So I'm just going to give you an overview of how I got it up in place, what I did, mistakes I made, and helpful hints as well. So as far as mounting the gates and welding the hinges and all that, I did that all before putting the wooden slats in the gate because of the amount of weight those wooden slats add. It would have made the whole process harder. So I did the wooden slats at the very end of this project. So I was able to use an overhead crane to hold the gate up into place while welding the hinges to the fence post. However, that's probably not accessible to you, so you could always stick some blocks under the gate with the amount of gap that you want to have the gate above the ground and hold it that way, and then just balance it on the blocks. Once I held my gate up in place, I judged how close I wanted my gate to go on the latch side. So I had figured a 1-inch gap between the gate and the bar was plenty of distance. However, my wife was able to reach in and open the latch with that 1-inch gap, so we ended up having to redo it and get it down to about 1/2 inch spacing between the bar and the gate. One other mistake I ended up making while installing this gate was mounting the post into the ground. I should have put it a little closer to the edge of the cinder block. And the reason I say that is because I wanted to be able to open my gate both ways and have full access. And in order to do that, I had to put about 1.5 inch spacer on the post to hold the hinge so that the gate would not hit the cinder block when I open it to the street side. So I'm not going to lie, anchoring these hinges to the post, I ended up grinding them off 2 or 3 times to get this gate set correctly. Now the whole reason I ended up trying to hide that steel post behind the cinder block is because of my HOA. I didn't want to have any issues. However, I think if I would have stuck it about an inch out past the cinder block, it wouldn't have been a problem and I wouldn't have to have these big spacers on the top and bottom of my hinges. So once I figured out my spacing, I tack welded the top hinge in place and checked level on both sides. Then I set my gate on the top hinge, supporting it so it would not leverage the hinge off. Put a level on the gate front to back to check level, and went to the latch side and checked the gap between my gate and the post to make sure they were equal top to bottom. I ended up having to add an extra 1/4 inch spacer to the bottom hinge to get that spacing equal on the latch side. Whether that was the cinder block on that side being a little off or whether my gate was a little off, irregardless, it was not that noticeable at the end result. So the hinges I bought were ball bearing and greasable. I used some grease to hold the ball bearings while setting the gate into place. So since this is such a wide gate, I put a second latch in that goes into the ground as well. Because we had a decent windstorm, and with just the single latch, that gate was really wobbly on the latch side. I made a holder so I didn't have to hold the handle in the up position while opening the gate. I also made it tall enough so I would not have to bend over to do it. So all I used was a 1/2 inch piece of steel rod and then bent a 90-degree angle on it for a handle. Then using some small pieces of angle iron, I just drilled a hole barely bigger than 1/2 inch for the rod to slide through and used 2 1/4 inch bolts to secure them to the gate. So for the bracket that holds the handle in the up position, I just used that same angle iron, stuck it in my vise, and then took a hammer and slowly bent it over to produce a little bit of a lip so the handle would not slide off while opening and closing the gate. So I wanted a latch that would not be able to be opened from the outside, so I got one that would mount to the center of the gate. I bolted my latching mechanism to the gate, then marked my hole where I needed to drill into the bracket for the latch. I went all the way to the one side of the angle so I would have plenty of distance for the latch to go all the way in, and drilled the hole for it. So if you haven't seen my other video on upgrades that I've made to an RV gate, on the original gate that came with this house, I kept having a problem with the weight of the gate pulling the hinges out of the wall or the brackets that hold the hinges out of the wall. What I did to correct that on that gate was lay a little concrete pad and put a small caster so the weight would be evenly distributed between that caster and the hinges instead of all the weight being on the hinges themselves. It worked out well, and I decided to do that same concept on this gate. So I went with a pretty wet mixture of concrete. Right here I'm just using my trowel to push the air bubbles to the top of the concrete for a stronger mix. Now I've said this in previous videos, but I'm no professional concrete layer, but most of my projects have come out pretty decent. Finishing a little piece of concrete like this with a trowel is not that big of a deal. So I basically dug out and just made a wooden form to fit in here. It's kind of a weird shape, but that's because where I'm going to put my caster, that was kind of the most surface area for the caster to run on. If you didn't notice, I actually put a little steel tube in the concrete as well, so that my latch that goes into the ground has a nice tube to go into. So for this platform, I used scrap wood that I had, and I think I did it 4 inches thick. The trowel that I had, I bought it at Lowe's years ago for less than 10 bucks, and it was a couple bags of concrete. The caster was a couple bucks, and then I did fabricate a little bracket to hold the caster as well. Right here, I'm just checking my latch to make sure it goes into the steel tube correctly. Then I'm grabbing a little bit more concrete to go around it. I didn't want to put the concrete in before checking to make sure my latch was going in smoothly. Right here, I'm just finishing the concrete around there, and then I ended up going to the outside of the gate and smoothing out the concrete as well. When you're troweling out concrete, you want to have a little bit of an angle on the trowel. Otherwise, you might dig into the concrete and not finish it smoothly. So I let that concrete dry overnight before stripping all the forms off of it, and then I ended up backfilling all the dirt. So in order to make my caster bracket, I just had a couple pieces of flat steel, bolted it to the gate, drilled the holes for the caster, bolted the caster to another plate. Then with my gate in the closed position with all the latches in, I set my caster up into place and marked where I needed to weld the two plates together. I did end up putting a little bit of a gusset on this as well for strength. So my plan was that this caster was only going to be used on the concrete pad. However, what I didn't think about is with the way the grade is in my side yard tapering towards the front, the caster does end up running in the gravel a little bit in the side yard. And I should have just put a little bigger caster that would have handled that a little better. Now the hinges will hold the weight, and I could just dig this out a little bit more. I just haven't got around to it. So if you can, the last thing you want to do is put the boards on the gate. The reason being is it just adds a lot of extra weight that you don't want to have to mess with while you're doing all the other stuff. This is pretty self-explanatory. One thing I did mess up on is I measured my old gate and measured the gap, and then the wooden slats I got were wider than that, so I had to take each one to a table saw and rip off a little bit. So it's definitely worth going and measuring the planks that you're going to use before welding your gate together. That's something I didn't think about. I just measured what was on the previous gate. So I had laid a couple of 2x4s out on the ground and laid all my wood slats out, stained them, and then water treated them before putting them on the gate. Trust me, it's a lot easier that way. And since I had already drilled the holes in the gate, all I did was set the plank in place, drill through the board while somebody was holding the wood, put the carriage bolt in, and tightened it down with my impact. So I had bought some dull finished carriage bolts, and the reason I did that is I wanted to paint the heads black because I didn't want a really shiny carriage bolt. What I didn't realize is that they're 1/4 thread. However, a grade 5 1/4x20 nut would not thread on this bolt. I had realized this because I had bought the carriage bolts beforehand so I could get them painted and forgot to buy nuts. So I just sent the wife down to get some 1/4x20 nuts, came back with some grade 5 nuts, and they would not thread on. I went back all pissed off to Lowe's and realized next to those dull finish carriage bolts there was special nuts right by them. Just something to watch out for so it doesn't happen to you. I thought a 1/4x20 nut was a 1/4x20 nut. So after using my one-piece gate for a couple weeks to make sure I wasn't going to have any major issues, because if I did, I could always put the old gate back on, I went ahead and ground the heads of the wedge anchors on the post so I could take those off, then rented a quickie saw to cut the masonry block. Now this did take some trial and error, but what ended up working best for me is I took the quickie saw and cut 3 sides of the cinder block, then took a big sledgehammer and cracked away the cinder block at the bottom. So most likely, if you are removing a cinder block and it had a gate mounted to it, it is going to be concrete filled. So then I took the quickie saw and cut all the way down as deep as I could go into the concrete, then took the sledgehammer again and broke away as much of the concrete as possible. We tied a strap to the top of the cinder block and began tugging on it while I cracked away the concrete. Probably not the safest way to go here, but it did end up working. We almost took out the brand new RV gate while it was coming down, but barely tugged it out of the way just in time. The thin cinders between the big blocks will come off by hand or with a pry bar or a hammer. There is some wire mesh between some of them, but overall didn't have any problem getting these ones off. And as always, demolition is a lot more fun than putting stuff together. However, the cleanup was a pain. My end goal with this gate is to put an electric gate opener on it. However, I want to use it for 3 or 4 months and make sure I don't have any other issues with it. Plus, it's too damn hot in the summer in Phoenix, Arizona to mess with it right now anyways. So with electric gate openers, the ones I'm thinking about using, just use a rod to hold the gate to its closed position. However, with this big of a gate and with it being slatted with wood, my confidence in it holding up against a big windstorm without being latched on the other side is not very good. So they do make electromagnetic gate locks, and I will probably be installing one of those as well. So hopefully this video gave you guys some good information and helped you out, and maybe keeps you from doing some of the dumb stuff that I did during this process. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I've got a lot of other DIY projects going from anything from mechanical to furniture builds to storage ideas. As always, guys, I try and get the most information in the least amount of time as possible as to not waste your time, and hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.